Let me begin tonight by addressing a headline that has shaken not only Eastern Europe, but the world at large. Putin for a Russian hypersonic missile destroys Ukrainian military base, Zelensky seeks protection. Now, when you hear those words, they are not just about military technology or battlefield maneuvers. They are about power, fear, and the dangerous chess game of global geopolitics that has spiraled into a new phase of escalation. Let's be clear. Russia's use of hypersonic missiles is not merely a tactical strike. It is a message to Ukraine, a message to NATO, and a message to the world that Moscow is willing to employ the most advanced, terrifying tools in its arsenal to maintain its strategic dominance. These are weapons that move at such extraordinary speeds that interception is nearly impossible. In other words, this is a demonstration of supremacy designed to remind every other player in this war that Russia holds cards few others can match. And what does President Zelensky do in response? He seeks protection. He calls upon NATO, the United States, and Europe to shield Ukraine from destruction. And here lies the crux of the problem. Ukraine has been caught between the ambitions of two great powers, one trying to expand its sphere of influence, the other unwilling to let it slip away. What we see now is not simply the tragedy of one destroyed military base. It is the escalation of a cycle that places millions of lives at risk with the very real possibility of spiraling into a broader, more catastrophic conflict. Russia's decision to unleash its hypersonic missile against a Ukrainian military base has reverberated across the globe, not only because of the destruction it caused, but because of what it represents in the larger geopolitical game. Hypersonic weapons are not ordinary missiles. They travel at speeds so extraordinary that traditional defense systems cannot keep pace, rendering them almost impossible to intercept. This makes their use not only militarily devastating but also psychologically terrifying. For Moscow, choosing to deploy such a weapon at this stage of the war is not just about targeting a base or crippling a segment of Ukraine's defense capacity. It is about sending a message, a bold and unmistakable demonstration of strength that resonates far beyond the battlefield. The use of this technology is a strategic escalation. Up to now, Russia has employed a mix of conventional artillery, drones, and cruise missiles. By shifting into hypersonics, the Kremlin is raising the stakes in a way that cannot be ignored by its adversaries. It is telling Kyiv, NATO, and Washington that Russia is willing to use its most advanced tools, the crown jewels of its military arsenal, to secure its objectives. This isn't just warfare. It's theater. A performance intended to shock, to intimidate, and to remind the world of Russia's unique military advantages. The psychological impact of that choice may be even greater than the physical destruction itself. What makes this moment so consequential is not only the weapon used, but the timing. Russia chose this strike precisely when Western military aid to Ukraine is ramping up. When the flow of weapons from NATO countries is trying to bolster Kyiv's defenses, the message here is sharp. Whatever weapons you send, however much support you provide, Russia can still strike decisively and in ways you cannot easily defend against. It is a chess move designed to shift momentum and force adversaries to reconsider the costs of pushing too far. And yet, beneath the drama of the headlines, there is another reality to confront. Hypersonic weapons are not simply about Russia versus Ukraine. They are about shifting the global balance of power. The United States and China are both racing to perfect similar systems. And Russia's deployment serves as proof that the technology is no longer theoretical. It is battlefield ready. That raises the stakes for everyone. Because once one nation uses such a weapon, others feel compelled to accelerate their own development, ensuring that the arms race grows more dangerous by the day. This strike, therefore, is not just about crippling Ukraine. It is about altering the psychological landscape of global security. Here is where we must step back and ask the deeper question. Who truly benefits from such escalations? The answer is not the soldiers on the ground, not the civilians caught in the crossfire, and certainly not the millions struggling with the rising costs of food, energy, and inflation tied to this conflict. The real beneficiaries are the power players and industries who profit from fear, from insecurity, and from the endless cycle of arms production. Every hypersonic test, Every missile launched becomes a justification for pouring billions more into defense budgets. Every headline about impossible-to-stop weapons drives governments into the hands of military contractors who promise protection at any price. So while Russia celebrates its successful strike and Ukraine mourns another devastating blow, the larger story is one of signals, profits, and fear. Hypersonic weapons are not just tools of war. They are tools of politics and economics designed to reshape the global order and remind both allies and adversaries that Russia still commands attention on the world stage. The danger, of course, is that these signals can spiral out of control. Once such weapons are used, the temptation to use them again increases and the line between deterrence and escalation begins to blur. The strike on that Ukrainian base is therefore not just another event in this conflict. It is a harbinger of a new, more perilous phase of warfare, one that puts the world itself on edge. When we talk about Putin's fury, we are not merely referring to a single act of aggression or the destruction of one Ukrainian military base. What we are witnessing is the manifestation of years of mounting frustration, suspicion, and hostility that have shaped Russia's posture toward Ukraine and the West. This fury is not spontaneous. It is calculated, it is strategic, and it is meant to send a signal that Russia will not be cornered or humiliated on the world stage. The deployment of hypersonic missiles is not just a military choice. It is a symbolic one, reflecting the Kremlin's willingness to escalate the conflict when it believes its core interests are being undermined. Vladimir Putin understands the power of perception in war. He knows that showing restraint can be interpreted as weakness, especially when NATO continues to flood Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and training. The fury here is not uncontrolled rage, but rather a carefully curated display designed to convey strength at a time when Russia feels encircled. Hypersonic missiles are chosen not only because of their effectiveness, but because they carry with them a message. Russia has technology and resolve that no Western ally can ignore. This is furious performance designed to both intimidate adversaries and reassure domestic audiences that their leader is still firmly in control. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this fury. Putin has staked much of his political legacy on the idea of restoring Russia's strength and standing in the world. The war in Ukraine, far from being a limited operation, has turned into a long, grinding confrontation that tests his credibility. Every Ukrainian counteroffensive, every NATO shipment of advanced weapons, every speech by President Zelensky calling for global support. These are challenges to Putin's authority, to his promise that Russia cannot be undermined by outside forces. His fury, then, is also defensive, an attempt to push back against the narrative that Russia is being dragged into a costly stalemate. What makes this fury so dangerous is that it thrives on escalation. Each time Russia feels pressured or humiliated, the response risks becoming more severe. Putin's decision to use hypersonic missiles is an example of this logic. It shows that Russia is not afraid to up the ante even at the risk of pushing the conflict closer to direct confrontation with NATO. This is not just about destroying Ukrainian infrastructure. It is about demonstrating that Moscow has no intention of backing down no matter the cost. The danger here is that such fury, once unleashed, creates a momentum of its own, narrowing the space for diplomacy and pushing all sides toward decisions that might otherwise have seemed unthinkable. But beyond the geopolitical stage, there is another hook we must not ignore. Fury in politics is not simply about international relations. It is also about managing domestic pressure. For Putin, showing fury toward Ukraine and the West is a way of channeling frustration at home, where ordinary Russians feel the economic pinch of sanctions, rising costs, and growing isolation by projecting anger outward by targeting Ukraine with devastating force. The Kremlin seeks to deflect anger inward, keeping the population focused on external enemies rather than internal discontent. This is a classic maneuver of leaders under strain. Rage against the outsider to hold together a fragile inside. So, when we talk about Putin's fury, we are not just describing a moment of rage. We are describing a deliberate tactic, a weapon in itself, one that is wielded to shape perception, control narratives, and shift the balance of power. The use of hypersonic missiles may be the physical manifestation of this fury. But the true impact lies in the fear it generates, the uncertainty it spreads, and the sense of inevitability it creates. This is fury as strategy, fury theater, fury as a tool to remind the world that Russia's resolve, however costly, remains unbroken. President Vladimir Zelensky's response to Russia's hypersonic missile strike was swift and telling. He sought protection. This was not just the reaction of a leader whose military had suffered yet another devastating blow. It was the voice of a man in a government trapped in the most precarious position any state can endure, caught between survival and annihilation. When Zelensky turns once more to NATO, to Washington, to Europe, it reflects both Ukraine's vulnerability and the broader truth of this war. Kyiv cannot withstand Russia's relentless strikes alone. The request for protection is more than a plea. It is a calculated reminder to the West that Ukraine's fight is tied directly to their own security and credibility. Zelensky has mastered the art of framing his appeals in ways that resonate globally. Every time he steps onto the world stage, whether through a video address to the U.S. Congress, a speech in Berlin, or an interview broadcast in London, he positions Ukraine as the front line of a larger battle. Democracy versus authoritarianism, freedom versus tyranny. The latest missile strike only sharpens that narrative. By highlighting Ukraine's exposure to weapons so advanced that they are almost impossible to stop, Zelensky turns his nation's vulnerability into a rallying cry for greater support. It is a political strategy, as much as a survival tactic. If Ukraine falls, he argues, then the threat will move westward, forcing NATO into a confrontation on its own territory. There is a hook here that cannot be ignored. Protection is not only about weapons, shields, or alliances, it is about legitimacy. Zelensky understands that every strike on Ukrainian soil, every civilian killed, and every military base destroyed chips away at the credibility of Western leaders who claim to stand with Ukraine. His appeal for protection, then, is a way of holding those leaders accountable. If they fail to provide sufficient defense, if they hesitate or fracture in their commitment, then their lofty promises of solidarity are exposed as hollow. In this way, Zelensky is using his country's suffering as leverage, turning Ukraine's role as the victim of aggression into a moral and strategic weapon. At the same time, his repeated requests also reveal the hard limits of Ukraine's independence in this war. A sovereign state should, in theory, be able to defend its own borders and determine its own destiny. But in reality, Ukraine's fate now hinges almost entirely on the flow of Western weapons, the resolve of NATO, and the political will of leaders thousands of miles away. Every new Russian escalation deepens that dependency. Seeking protection is not a sign of weakness on Zelensky's part. It is an acknowledgement of reality in a world where the balance of power is heavily tilted. And yet Zelensky's call for protection does something else. It raises the stakes for everyone listening. Because the more urgent his plea, the harder it becomes for NATO and the West to remain on the sidelines. Protection is not just about defending Ukraine. It is about forcing Western capitals to confront a dangerous question. How far are they willing to go before their own credibility is at risk? Will they provide missile defense systems capable of countering hypersonics or risk watching Ukraine reduced to rubble while explaining to their own people why they did nothing? This is the trap Zelensky has set intentionally or not. His appeals for protection, amplified by the destruction of a hypersonic strike, force Western leaders to make choices they would rather avoid. If they give Ukraine too much, they risk provoking a direct clash with Russia. If they give too little, they risk losing Ukraine, and with it the moral high ground they have claimed since the war began. In this way, Zelensky's search for protection is not only about saving his country. It is about reshaping the geopolitical commitments of the West, binding them tighter and tighter to Ukraine's fate. The hypersonic strike on Ukraine has forced NATO into perhaps the most dangerous balancing act it has faced since the Cold War. On one side lies the moral and strategic imperative to stand with Ukraine to prove that promises of support are not just empty rhetoric. On the other side lies the sobering risk of provoking a direct clash with Russia, a nuclear superpower willing to escalate in ways that no Western capital can easily predict. This is NATO's dilemma, a tightrope walk where every step risks either collapse of credibility or the outbreak of a wider war. The alliance was never designed for half measures. Its founding principle, collective defense, is absolute. An attack on one is an attack on all. But Ukraine is not a member, and that simple fact creates a constant tension between symbolic solidarity and actual obligations. NATO leaders have been clear in their messaging. They will arm, they will train, they will finance, but they stop short of putting boots on the ground or implementing a no-fly zone.
Why?
Because they know the difference between supplying a partner and directly engaging in combat with Russia. That line is what has kept this war regional. But it is also what makes NATO appear hesitant, even divided in the face of escalating violence. The hypersonic strike raises that tension to a new level. How does NATO respond to weapons that even its most advanced defense systems struggle to counter? If Russia can obliterate a Ukrainian base with technology that moves faster than the speed of detection, then what confidence can smaller NATO states on the eastern flank truly have in their own protection? The strike was not just a blow against Ukraine. It was a signal to Poland, to the Baltics, to Romania that Russia can reach far and strike hard. For NATO, failing to address that signal risks undermining the entire foundation of deterrence that has held Europe together for decades. The hook here is that NATO's credibility is not only being tested abroad, but also at home. Citizens in Europe and North America are watching the conflict unfold daily on their screens. They see Ukrainian cities bombed. They hear Zelensky's urgent pleas, and they demand action. Yet, they also fear the specter of nuclear escalation. NATO leaders must therefore navigate the expectations of their own people, balancing the anger that demands decisive action with the anxiety that recoils from the possibility of World War II. This is not merely a strategic dilemma. It is a political one where every decision reverberates through parliaments, congresses, and elections. What makes NATO's position so precarious is that hesitation can be just as dangerous as overreaction. If the alliance does too little, Russia interprets it as weakness, emboldening further aggression. If it does too much, Moscow interprets it as provocation, potentially inviting a catastrophic escalation. Every shipment of weapons, every sanctions package, every joint statement is calibrated to walk this line to project unity without crossing thresholds that could ignite a larger conflict. Yet, the more Russia escalates, the narrower that line becomes, forcing NATO closer to the moment when hesitation or boldness will no longer be enough. The dilemma is sharpened further by divisions within NATO itself. Some members like Poland and the Baltic states push for stronger intervention, seeing Russia's actions as an existential threat. Others like Germany or Hungary tread cautiously, wary of economic consequences and the risks of confrontation. The alliance prides itself on unity, but behind closed doors there are fractures. Fractures that Russia is eager to exploit. The hypersonic strike magnifies these differences because it underscores the urgency of the threat while exposing the lack of clear consensus on how far NATO is willing to go. This is the tightrope NATO now walks suspended between credibility and catastrophe. And the world watches closely because the choices made in Brussels, Washington, and other capitals will determine not only Ukraine's survival, but also the stability of Europe and the balance of global power. Every move carries consequences, and the room for error grows smaller with each Russian escalation. Behind every explosion, every missile strike, and every headline about Ukraine, there lies another layer to this war that is less visible, but no less powerful. The vast web of economic and military interests that thrive on conflict. Wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are sustained in boardrooms, in defense ministries, and in the ledgers of corporations that see opportunity in destruction. When Russia launched its hypersonic missile, it was not just demonstrating military might. It was also feeding into a cycle where the demand for weapons, contracts, and military technologies grows without limit. This is the hidden economy of war, and it is one of the most dangerous forces shaping our world today. Consider the sheer scale of resources involved. Russia pours billions into its arms sector, justifying it as a matter of survival against NATO encirclement. Every new weapon system unveiled, every strike carried out strengthens the narrative that the state must keep investing in advanced technology to stay ahead of its enemies. The hypersonic missile itself is more than a weapon. It is a symbol of national pride and industrial achievement, sold to the Russian people as proof that their sacrifices are yielding unmatched strength. This is how economic logic and political necessity merge, fund the military, expand production, and rally the nation around the image of superiority. But Russia is not alone in this cycle. The West, led by the United States, has its own version of the same story. Each time Ukraine suffers an attack, each time President Zelensky pleads for help, the defense industry in Washington and Europe finds justification for billions more in contracts. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop, Grumman. These companies are not just bystanders to the conflict. They are among its greatest beneficiaries. Every package of aid passed by Congress or the European Parliament includes lucrative deals for arms manufacturers, tanks, drones, anti-missile systems, and ammunition flow eastward, while profits flow upward. The cycle is self-perpetuating. More war creates more demand, and more demand guarantees more war. Here lies the hook. What looks like strategy on the surface often disguises economic necessity underneath. Governments frame their decisions as matters of principle, defending democracy, resisting aggression. But beneath the speeches and press releases, there are contracts to fulfill, investors to satisfy, and industries to sustain. The war becomes not only a clash of nations, but also a marketplace where destruction itself is the commodity. The more intense the fighting, the more valuable the product. This reality makes peace not just elusive, but threatening to those whose power and wealth depend on perpetual conflict. For ordinary people, this is the most bitter truth. While factories ramp up production and corporations record soaring profits, citizens in Ukraine, Russia, and even Europe and America shoulder the costs. Ukrainians lose their homes and families. Russians endure sanctions, inflation, and restricted goods. Europeans pay higher energy bills while Americans face ballooning defense budgets that divert funds away from healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The benefits of war are privatized, but the costs are socialized, borne by those with the least power to change the system. This is why the economic dimension of war must be exposed. Without recognizing it, the conflict appears only as a tragic clash of values or territorial ambitions. In truth, it is also an engine of profit, one that rewards escalation and punishes de-escalation. When Russia fires a hypersonic missile, the reverberations are not just felt in Ukraine's ruins. They echo in the stock prices of defense companies, in the financial projections of arms manufacturers, and in the political speeches that justify yet another round of spending. The economy of war is not a sideshow to the conflict. It is one of its driving forces, quietly determining its duration and intensity. The Russian hypersonic strike on Ukraine is not only a regional act of war. It is a global warning. For years, analysts and strategists have speculated about the impact of hypersonic weapons, their speed, their unpredictability, and their potential to reshape warfare. But speculation has now become reality. When Moscow fired that missile, it was announcing to the world that the age of hypersonic warfare had arrived. And with it, a new era of insecurity. Unlike conventional weapons, these missiles travel at speeds that make interception nearly impossible. They compress reaction times for governments and militaries into mere minutes, forcing decisions to be made with terrifying haste. This is not just about Ukraine. It is about the fragility of global stability itself. The warning is clear. Technology has outpaced diplomacy. Institutions that were built to manage conflicts. The United Nations Arms Control Treaties, international watchdogs were designed for a different age, an age when weapons could be tracked, intercepted, negotiated over. But hypersonics defy those frameworks. How can you negotiate a balance of power when one side possesses weapons that can bypass defenses and strike before a phone call can even be placed? Russia's strike demonstrated not just its own capabilities, but the obsolescence of existing structures meant to contain such threats. The world is now facing a weapon for which there is no reliable shield, and that reality destabilizes every security calculation. Here lies the hook. If Russia can deploy these weapons today, others will follow tomorrow. The United States and China are already racing to refine their own hypersonic arsenals. Once such weapons are used in real combat, the pressure to catch up becomes irresistible. This means we are on the cusp of a new arms race, one that will be faster, more expensive, and more dangerous than the nuclear buildup of the last century. Unlike nuclear weapons, which were so destructive that their very use created hesitation, hypersonics blur the line between conventional and strategic warfare. They can be deployed tactically, but with devastating effect, tempting leaders to use them more readily. This temptation is precisely what makes them such a global risk. For smaller nations, the warning is even more severe. Countries that rely on missile defense systems, on international guarantees, or on the deterrence of alliances now see that these protections may not hold against hypersonics. If a Ukrainian base can be destroyed in seconds, what does that mean for NATO's eastern flank? What does it mean for nations in Asia caught between the military ambitions of China and the presence of U.S. bases in the Pacific? The fear is not abstract. It is immediate and deeply destabilizing, creating a sense that no one is truly safe once these weapons are unleashed. At the same time, the strike also signals a psychological shift. Wars are not only fought with weapons, they are fought with fear. By showcasing hypersonics, Russia has injected a new level of anxiety into the calculations of every defense ministry around the world. Leaders now know that their critical infrastructure, their bases, even their capitals could be struck with little warning and few defenses. This constant uncertainty breeds instability, making diplomatic negotiations harder and military miscalculations more likely. The margin for error shrinks, and history has shown that in such conditions wars are often triggered not by deliberate choice but by misunderstanding and panic. This is why the hypersonic strike must be seen for what it truly is: a global alarm bell. It is a warning not only to Ukraine but to the entire international community that the world is entering a new perilous phase of military competition. If leaders fail to respond with foresight, if they continue to prioritize escalation over diplomacy, then the age of hypersonics will not just mark a technological milestone. It will mark the erosion of global security itself. Let me close by saying this. The destruction of a Ukrainian base is tragic, yes, but it is also a warning. A warning of where unchecked militarism and economic interests can lead us. If history has taught us anything, it is that wars fought with new and terrifying weapons rarely remain contained. The world is once again playing with fire, and unless we shift course, the flames may soon engulf us all. Thank you.